It was not enough for him to die for us. He wanted that we love one another.
During her lifetime, Mother Teresa of Calcutta was an inspiration to millions. All her life, she lived chaste, righteous, and full of love. It was not until her mother's death that people learned about what she had to endure in the last years of her life. She struggled with depression and a crisis of faith while still carrying out her mission of spreading good news and accompanying the poor and suffering. Her anguish was at a much higher pitch, and her response was at a much higher spiritual level of intensity. At the same time, she also revealed shocking information to believers around the world on her journey to God. Battle of Faith during Mother's final days. In 2007, a book called Come Be My Light was published featuring her personal and private correspondence. This book caused both sorrow and confusion among her admirers and a sense of delight in her critics. One of Mother Teresa's deepest fears after she founded the Missionaries of Charity was that she or one of her sisters and brothers would do or say something to cause scandal or detract from the order's mission. In all likelihood, this explains, at least in part, her reluctance to speak publicly of the interior locutions she had experienced for 7 or 8 months after the call. Within a call came on the train to Darjeeling. Yet Teresa did cause scandal, although only after she'd been dead for a decade, and then only for a short time. The book Come Be My Light collected many of her most personal and private correspondence. It immediately caused sorrow and confusion in her admirers, and a glee that bordered on what the Germans call Schadenfreude, taking pleasure in another's misfortune, in her detractors. Her letters revealed that, except for one short period, Teresa had been afflicted with a deep sense of God's absence for the last half-century of her life. Such was her unflagging dedication to the work she'd undertaken for God that most of the world was completely unsuspecting of her spiritual darkness. On hearing the news, many Christians were confused. What did Teresa's long stay in the spiritual wilderness mean? Was she a victim of depression? Had she lost faith in God? What gave her the inner strength to carry on even when she anguished over what she felt to be God's abandonment of her? Even Teresa's closest companions and the Missionaries of Charity were bewildered. Never had she made any reference to the darkness except for an oblique reference that would have meant nothing to anyone but her confessors, with whom she shared what she was going through. 4 years before she died, she warned her sisters that the devil is continuously on the prowl in order to make you feel it is impossible that Jesus really loves you, is really cleaving to you. This is a danger for all of us. None of them could have guessed that the remark was autobiographical. Teresa's detractors pointed to the revelations in Come Be My Light as evidence that Teresa was a faux saint whose public displays of piety were hypocritical. Crisis of faith. It was the height of faith. Mother Teresa of Calcutta won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979 for her wholehearted service to the poor and suffering around the world. Yet today, conversations about her spirituality, while not overlooking her charity, tend to speculate about the interior darkness she experienced for almost 50 years. A few years after the death of Mother Teresa in 1997, a cache of letters was discovered in the footlocker of Jesuit Father Celeste van Exem, confessor and spiritual director, and led to the shocking revelation that she had suffered for decades from a terrifying desolation. Our smiling and cheerful saint of the slums was abruptly cast into the company of atheists, agnostics, and spiritual cynics by popular media sources, while, sadly, the urgent injunction she had received from the Lord to come be my light was overlooked or misunderstood. In religious circles, Mother Teresa's darkness was immediately associated with the mystical and poetical writings of St. John of the Cross as expressed in The Dark Night of the Soul and the Ascent of Mount Carmel. Some of her letters speak of the deep and lasting spiritual pain she experienced, as in this example from 1959. That darkness that surrounds me on all sides, I can't lift my soul to God. No light or inspiration enters my soul. In 1942, Mother Teresa made an unusual private vow to give God anything that he may ask and not to refuse him anything. Her private vow was made 4 years before her Call Within a Call, also known as Inspiration Day by missionaries of charity. On September 10, 1946, while traveling by train from Calcutta to Darjeeling for her annual retreat, she had a mystical experience that anointed her with the charism and spirituality of the missionaries of charity. The graces she received continued for almost 2 years and ceased only when she had the necessary canonical permissions to depart. And dressed in her blue sari, she walked into the slums. Her first rules, drafted during the novena preceding Pentecost 1947, give meaning to this particular vision. Her general end aim was to satiate the thirst of Jesus on the cross for loving souls. Her particular end means was service to the poor in the spirit of Matthew 25:40. Whatever you did to one of these least ones, you did it to me. The image of a childlike Mother Teresa standing beneath the cross with Mary and the poor has become something of a locus theologicus for the missionaries of charity. The vocation to remain with Mary wherever Jesus is suffering in his mystical body. So how then are we to interpret her interior darkness? The spirituality of Mother Teresa reveals the darkness in several different forms. For instance, the Synoptic Gospels recount the actual darkness of Good Friday afternoon that overshadows all who are present near the cross. Mother Teresa of Calcutta made a daily choice to stay here in the spiritual darkness. Let us always remain with Mary, our mother on Calvary, near the crucified Jesus. Therefore, the interior darkness cannot be separated from her mission to persevere in the night of Jesus' ongoing crucifixion in his suffering poor. She chose to remain near his cross in the darkness until her death. A different type of darkness is revealed on Holy Saturday and the descent into hell. The Lord commands Mother Teresa to go out and search for the last, the least, and the lost. The dark holes of the poor reflect their moral poverty by not knowing or loving Jesus. Thus, she is asked to descend into the living hell of the poorest of the poor. Jesus asks Mother Teresa to radiate his light in the darkness of their suffering when he says, "Come be my light." This is the light of the resurrection revealed on Easter Sunday. Hence, the spiritual itinerary of Saint Teresa of Calcutta beautifully parallels the Paschal mystery that includes both darkness and light. She and her followers become a living Lumen Christi that seeks to illumine the hearts of the poor. A soul in anguish. There's no sense in denying that Mother Teresa's sojourn in the wilderness is disconcerting. If God can seem absent to a saint like her, what chance do the rest of us have to connect with God? It's also quite probably true, given the nature of her work among the poorest of the poor, that at times Teresa felt psychologically depressed or burnt out. What normal person wouldn't? But to conclude that the darkness was the result of depression, much less o losafato, is to overlook its spiritual significance. Psychological depression is me-centered. The depressive's gaze is always directed inward. Teresa's, on the other hand, was directed outward, to the God whose absence she so keenly felt. Depression renders a sufferer listless. Mother Teresa was always on the go, doing the work to which she felt God had called her. Moreover, dark periods don't necessarily suggest a loss of faith. Instead, they are recognized in the Christian tradition as periods of great spiritual development. Many Christian saints have recounted their own experiences of darkness in their relationships with God, but it was the 16th century Saint John of the Cross who wrote what's still considered to be the best analysis of them. Not surprisingly, Mother Teresa knew his writings and once remarked that even though John's words made her hunger for God, they also expressed what for her was the terrible feeling of being unwanted by him. For John of the Cross, the dark night of the soul is a forlorn feeling of being abandoned by God. He writes, "Both the sense and the spirit, as though under an immense and dark load, undergo such agony and pain that the soul would consider death a relief. The soul suffers most from the conviction that God has rejected it, and with abhorrence cast it into darkness. But what feels like abandonment is far from it. The painful sense of being rejected by God is actually a purgation of the senses and spirit that prepares the way for an inflow of God into the soul. There is no set time limit for a dark night of the soul, although most do not last as long as Mother Teresa's did. Nor does the dark night mean that the sufferer has ceased to believe in God, although intense doubts can arise. In one of her letters, Mother Teresa writes, "In my soul, I feel just that terrible pain of loss, of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not really existing." Even if Teresa had never read John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul, she would have had some idea of it from her namesake, Saint Thérèse de Lisieux, the Little Flower, who likewise suffered from a sense of abandonment toward the end of her short life. Thérèse wrote that God hides is wrapped in darkness, and she accounted for this by arguing that the love of Christ is so overwhelming that its fullness has to be withheld from mortals, a withdrawal that naturally causes suffering. Mother Teresa's suffering when God hid from her was intense. From first to last, her private correspondence to her confessors attests to that. Just a few passages, representative of the whole, convey something of the loneliness into which her sense of God's absence drove her. The longing for God is terribly painful, and yet the darkness is becoming greater. What contradiction there is in my soul. What especially bewildered and saddened her was that the darkness had descended in 1949, right when she believed she was doing precisely the work God had created her to do. Her loss of the presence of God coincided with the granting of the long-sought permission to find the order that became the Missionaries of Charity. Surely, the Vatican's approval was a sign from God that He loved her and wanted her to succeed, but it was just at that point that she felt the door slam shut. God disappeared. There was to be but one time the door opened in her many years of darkness. Pope Pius XII was the pontiff who gave permission to found her order. When he died in October 1958, Archbishop Perrier celebrated a Requiem Mass in the Calcutta Cathedral. Teresa attended, and on that same day received a respite from her forlornness. But in just a short time, God thought it better for me to be in the tunnel, so He is gone again. Teresa would endure the tunnel for the next 4 decades. Say yes to God. As the years of darkness came and went, Mother Teresa slowly began to see them as something different from the dark night of the soul described by John of the Cross and experienced by Thérèse de Lisieux. It was, she concluded, an essential part of her vocation as a missionary of charity. Even as a teenager, Teresa had longed to serve the poor. When she became a missionary nun, she spent her Sundays roaming the slums around the Loreto compound, bringing relief to the poor. When she received the call within a call, she dedicated the rest of her life to giving the poor, the sick, the lonely, and the dying the love that the world had denied them. Moreover, she voluntarily took on their poverty as her own. Teresa dedicated her life to this work because she believed that Christ demanded it of her. As she so often said, when she succored the poor and the sick, she ministered to Christ in His distressing disguise, the Christ who thirsted. So it was perhaps inevitable, given that she shared in the suffering of the people she served, that Teresa would eventually discern her own inner poverty as a share in the suffering of Christ Himself. She remembered the oath she'd made back in 1942, never to deny God anything asked of her, and she realized that loyalty to the oath meant embracing God's withdrawal. We must know exactly when we say yes to God what is in that yes. It meant accepting whatever God gave and giving whatever God chose to take away. And for Teresa, it meant accepting the burden of Christ's passion. When she was allowed that insight into the nature of her darkness, she recognized it as an inevitable aspect of the call within a call, and would go so far as to say that she actually loved the darkness because it was a very, very small part of Jesus' darkness and pain on earth. Teresa's final years were ones in which poor health and physical suffering became her daily burden. Just a few months before her death, suffering from heart failure and pneumonia, she lay in a hospital bed, unable to speak because of the bronchial tube that had been inserted to help her breathe. She tried to communicate with her caretakers by writing on slips of paper, but was too weak to do so. Finally, mustering all her strength, she was able to scrawl, "I want Jesus." Mass was celebrated in her hospital room, and she was able to take a small amount of the consecrated wine. Those who were with her at the time believed that her request for Jesus meant that she desired the Eucharist, and that's surely a part of what she meant to communicate. But given her decades of living without a sense of Christ's presence, it's not too much to conclude that she also meant she wanted the darkness of God's withdrawal to end. She'd spent over 50 years reliving Christ's passion. If it was God's will that she suffered, so be it. But she longed for it to end. In 1962, in the second decade of her sense of abandonment, Teresa wrote something that anticipated her later understanding of her vocation to suffer the passion of Christ. "If I ever become a saint, I will surely be one of darkness. I will continually be absent from heaven, to light the light of those in darkness on earth." This is an extraordinary thing to say, because it suggests that Mother Teresa was willing to relinquish the joy of heaven for the sake of those of us who also lie awake in the night wondering where God has gone. No one would deny that the diminutive nun who served Christ in his distressing disguise for over 50 years deserved some rest, but Teresa thought otherwise. Her lifelong dedication to serving God in His people was, so far as she was concerned, only an apprenticeship for her real work after she died. Mother Teresa's Gospel on 5 Fingers. For those who have never heard Mother Teresa's famous Gospel on 5 Fingers, simply imagine the petite and wizened founder of the Missionaries of Charity counting out these words on the digits of a hand, your hand, you, did it to me. Intoning Jesus Christ's words from Matthew 25:40. "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." She was not only offering a vivid visual demonstration of Christ's pronouncement, Mother Teresa also was issuing both an invitation and a challenge. In nearly every public talk she gave, Mother Teresa mentioned Matthew 25:40. It would not be going too far to say that her life was modeled on this verse. But what if that verse has more layers of meaning than imagined? In some modern translations, this sentence from Matthew is translated as, "You did it for me." Is it "you did it to me" or "you did it for me"? The Greek of the verse is ambiguous. It can be translated either way. But the difference in these two renderings is significant. You know, one little word has a very big impact. The verse, "You did it for me," suggests that believers should see themselves as Jesus' ambassadors and do works of mercy on His behalf. And that is certainly true. But the translation, "You did it to me," is more probable and more arresting. In this reading, Jesus is so identified with the poor and the suffering that anything that is done to them is, at a deeper level, an action done directly to Jesus. Notice it's not, "as if you had done it to me," it's, "you did it to me." As Mother Teresa deeply grasped, this is a very sobering thought. Jesus considers acts done to the needy as actually being done directly to Him. Most scholars agree that this second interpretation is likely the intended sense. In some mysterious way, actions done to the poor are acts simultaneously done to Christ. Mother Teresa's living out of Matthew 25:40 in her ministry to the poorest of the poor is a witness to a different view of the world, a different social imaginary, a witness to an encounter with Christ where others might see nothingness. Works of mercy are not about earning God's favor, but about as an odyssey, but about entering into the mystery of the kingdom. In Scripture, the poor have a completely different value in the social imaginary of God's economy. God has a special concern for the poor, Gregory added. In Proverbs 14:31 we read, "Those who oppress the poor insult their maker, but those who are kind to the needy honor him." Notice what this verse implies. God is so identified with the poor that our attitude toward God will be revealed by how we relate to the poorest around us. Care for the poor is not simply a good deed or an obligation. It is an integral declaration of faith that one believes in Jesus' kingdom, which is not of this world. Mother Teresa understood this truth deeply. In the book, A Call to Mercy, she explains why she takes the call of Matthew 25:40 this seriously. She says that she does this because I love God and because I believe His word. We can express our belief in God's grace to us by serving Christ in caring for the needy. Doing so allows us to incarnate the gospel in our lives, as what Mother Teresa did during her whole life. The pain of joy. With the possible exception of St. John Paul II, no saint in the history of the Church has been known by so many people at the time of canonization, which makes the holiness of this saint both more available for observation and more difficult to discern. Knowing more about someone is not the same as knowing them well, and in coming to know Mother Teresa as saint. Teresa, we are asked to deepen our knowledge of her according to her holiness, which her very public persona both hides and discloses. If she is a saint of darkness, she is also a saint of joy. Yet, knowing her as the one in darkness and the one in joy is not knowing two Teresas, but rather coming to know the one Teresa as a saint. Mother Teresa left happiness to find joy. The difference between happiness and joy is that happiness avoids suffering, and joy endures suffering and hope. To say that Mother Teresa left happiness to find joy means that she went towards suffering in hope. The suffering was not first hers, though it became hers, because she stayed close to those who suffer. The suffering in Teresa's joy was first of all Christ's, who suffered in and with the poorest of the poor. With them, they who were unwanted, unclaimed, unloved, Teresa heard over and over again the plaintive cry of Christ on the cross. I thirst. Thirsty for care, thirsty for contact, thirsty for love. Mother Teresa left her own comfort to comfort those whom no one comforted. To leave comfort was painful, but that pain bore something beautiful for God. In order to hear Christ's words, I thirst, Mother Teresa had to love Jesus very much. She had to love him very much because no one can hear those words from a distance, but only when very close to him, in the place where he suffers. Teresa stayed near the cross to hear Christ's words and contemplate them. Beneath the cross, she learned that the one who loves much suffers much. To say that Mother Teresa left happiness to find joy means that she went towards suffering in hope. The suffering was not first hers, though it became hers because she stayed close to those who suffer. In the Gospel of John, Jesus' mother and the beloved disciple stand with Mary Magdalene and others at the foot of the cross. In the Synoptic Gospels, the disciples who witnessed Jesus' crucifixion are watching from afar. But here in John's Gospel, those who love him much are close, and among them is the one who, at the Last Supper the night before, laid his head close to Jesus' heart. Looking to those close to him, Jesus gives his mother to the care of this beloved disciple and gives the beloved disciple to the care of his mother. He gives them each other in compassion, for comfort. He then speaks those words that became the center of Mother Teresa's spiritual life. I thirst. The life of Mother Teresa is a life spent at the foot of the cross, listening for Christ's thirst, learning what it means, sharing in it, and seeking to slake it. But for what does Christ thirst? In Psalm 69, his thirst is articulated. My throat is parched. I looked for compassion, but there was none, for comforters, but found none. Christ's thirst is for compassion, his thirst is for comfort, and he thirsts with those who have neither. Teresa loved Jesus very much, so she stayed close to his cross, where he thirsts with those who have been denied compassion, denied comfort, denied contact and care and consolation. The story of Saint Teresa of Calcutta is the story of a beloved disciple who left happiness to find joy at the foot of Christ's cross, where Christ thirsts for those the world leaves behind. In her singular mission to bring tender love and care to the poorest of the poor, she gave her beloved something to drink. In one of her letters, Mother Teresa asks her confessor, "Please ask Our Lady to give me her heart, so that I may with greater ease fulfill His desire in me." The beginning of Mother Teresa's mission was accompanied by mystical experiences. She heard the voice of Jesus and felt the incomparable sweetness of His inner presence. Yet all of that stopped for long years during her mission. "Please pray for me," she wrote at the time. "The longing for God is terribly painful, and yet the darkness is becoming greater. There is so much contradiction in my soul," she adds in another letter. "Such deep longing for God, so deep that it is painful, a suffering continual, and yet not wanted by God, repulsed, empty, no faith, no love, no zeal." It is sobering to think that at the height of her mission, Mother Teresa worked tirelessly without a drop of consolation. But this suffering was not without fruit. That excruciating spiritual pain, the feeling of being abandoned, even rejected, by God made her share more fully in the experience of Christ. It helped her identify more closely with the poor, the lonely, and the outcast. Through this inner torment, her love for God and for the poor grew and was purified.